Discovering a body in the deep forest. It was a misty morning on June 21, 2020, in Brooklyn Pines, a sprawling woodland on the outskirts of Trenton, New Jersey. Josh Carter, an avid runner in his early 30s, laced up his sneakers and set out for his usual trail run just after sunrise. The air was cool, the sunlight barely piercing through the dense canopy above. For Josh, this was his escape, a place of peace far removed from the noise of the city. But that morning, peace would be shattered in the most horrifying way. Josh had been running for about 20 minutes when something unusual caught his eye. A strangely uniform shape off the main path. It wasn't uncommon to find abandoned camping gear or trash left behind by careless hikers, but this felt different. The shape wasn't just lying still, it seemed deliberately positioned. Curiosity kept Josh moving forward, slowly this time as the gravel crunching beneath his feet gave way to soft soil and thick underbrush. Standing just a few yards away, he froze. "Is that a person?" Josh muttered to himself, stepping closer, his heart racing. There, in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, was the body of a man lying on his back. He was dressed in worn jeans and a black t-shirt, but the fabric around his neck and chest was stiff and darkened, a chilling indication that this was no accident or natural death. Josh stumbled back, clutching his phone with trembling hands as he fumbled to call 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, almost routine, as if she couldn't yet sense the gravity of the situation. I think I found a dead body," Josh stammered, blinking hard as though trying to erase what he'd just seen. "Sir, where are you located?" "In Brooklyn Pines. I'm on one of the trails, the old ridge path near the east entrance," he said, trying to keep his voice from cracking. "He's just there. He's not moving. There's blood." The operator stayed on the line, asking him questions to gather more details while dispatching officers and paramedics to the scene. "Does it appear as though the person is breathing?" she asked. "No, I didn't get too close, but I'm sure he's dead. There's just too much blood," Josh replied, his voice barely above a whisper. By the time officers arrived, Josh was sitting on a nearby log, his face pale and his hands shaking. He directed them to the spot where they quickly confirmed his worst fears. The man was indeed deceased. The scene was gruesome. The body showed multiple stab wounds, deep, violent, as if inflicted in a frenzy. A closer inspection revealed drag marks in the soil, as though the body had been moved here from another location. Nearby, a burnt patch of ground and a discarded lighter hinted that someone had tried and failed to cover their tracks. Detective Laura Hayes, the lead investigator on the case, arrived not long after. A veteran with 15 years of experience dealing with homicide, she took one look at the scene and knew this wasn't an accident or a random crime of passion. "This was planned," Laura murmured, crouching next to the body, her brown leather notebook already filling with observations. "Whoever did this wanted to make sure they couldn't be followed, but they weren't as careful as they thought." She instructed the forensics team to begin processing the area while her partner, Detective Marcus Boone, started canvassing hikers and joggers in the area. As Josh gave his statement to the officers, his voice trembled. "I've run this trail for years and I've never seen anything like this. This trail, it's always been so quiet, so safe. But now..." He trailed off, unable to find the words to describe the dread creeping through him. By mid-morning the crime scene had been cordoned off, with yellow police tape fluttering gently in the breeze. News outlets began to catch wind of the discovery, and reporters started gathering near the main entrance, adding an air of chaos to the already tense scene. For those living near the woods, a sense of unease settled in, the kind that leaves you double-locking your doors at night and listening too closely for the sound of footsteps. As crime scene investigators began piecing together the evidence, every footprint, fiber, and burn mark, the neighborhood buzzed with theories. Was it a drifter? A random robbery gone wrong? Or was the victim someone with dangerous enemies lurking in the shadows? What had the tranquil woods of Brooklyn Pines borne witness to that morning? And more chillingly, was it the last act of violence or just the beginning? Identifying the victim and initial suspicion. The body was taken to the local morgue for further examination, and by midday, the results of the initial autopsy, combined with fingerprints taken on the scene, revealed the victim's identity: Michael Dawson. Michael, 38 years old, was a well-respected structural engineer who worked on large-scale city projects in New York. He lived in a quiet loft apartment in Brooklyn, far removed from the deep woods of Brooklyn Pines where his body was discovered. Detective Laura Hayes leaned back in her office chair, flipping through Dawson's file. A talented professional with a relatively clean record. No red flags in his financials, no history of criminal activity. A routine background check painted Michael as a stable, responsible individual. "So, what the hell was Dawson doing out here?" Marcus Boone, Hayes' partner, asked as he leaned against the doorway, sipping his now lukewarm coffee. "I was just asking myself the same thing," Hayes replied, squinting at the report in front of her. "He doesn't live anywhere near Brooklyn Pines. No family connections, no known outdoor hobbies. This place isn't his usual turf, that's for sure." Boone placed his coffee cup on her desk, leaning over the open file. "The guy had no wallet, no phone on him. Someone obviously cleaned him out. Robbery?" "Maybe," Hayes said, though her tone was far from convinced. "Robbery doesn't usually come with multiple stab wounds and burn marks on the ground. That's the kind of rage you don't see in a plain old mugging." Before Boone could respond, a knock came at the door. Officer Jenny Clark stepped in, a set of printed records in hand. "Detectives, we've got something interesting here," Jenny began, sliding the papers onto Hayes' desk. "Dawson's name was flagged in a report 3 weeks ago. Apparently his wife, Grace Harper, filed a complaint about threatening behavior. Said he'd been controlling since their separation." "Wait," Boone interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Separated? I thought he was squeaky clean, a family man or something?" "Well, not exactly," Jenny replied. "The wife has a restraining order out against him. She claimed he'd been stalking her, showing up unannounced, and get this, threatening to release private photos of her if she didn't comply with some terms related to their divorce assets. Sound like motive to anyone?" Hayes leaned in closer. The pieces were starting to click, but the picture wasn't complete yet. Grace Harper. She might be worth a visit. If what she says is true though, Dawson could have made some serious enemies. "What I'm not getting," Boone interjected, "is how a guy like him, tooling around the city in a suit and tie, ends up dead in the middle of a forest with stab wounds. This feels messy, too messy for a simple revenge plot." Jenny nodded. "It gets weirder. The medical examiner just called. Dawson had defensive wounds, his hands were cut up to hell. He fought back pretty hard, but they think he bled out from a major artery in his neck. He didn't last long. And there's more," she added, flipping through her notes. "They found evidence that the body was moved. Drag marks in the dirt at least 10 feet from where the lighter and burn marks were. Somebody wanted to burn him, but they either ran out of time or didn't know what they were doing." Hayes frowned, scribbling notes in her leather-bound notebook. "Not exactly professional work. Either they panicked or they were amateurs. Do we have any witnesses? Someone who might have seen Dawson or anyone acting suspicious out here?" Jenny shook her head. "Just the runner who found the body. No sightings of Dawson at all in the area. Though, Marcus, you're gonna love this. Security footage from Trenton train station caught a man matching Dawson's description boarding a train about 12 hours before the approximate time of death. He was alone, but here's the kicker. A white sedan was spotted at the station entrance trailing Dawson when he left. The plate belonged to one John Walker, a mechanic." Boone smirked, already halfway out of the room. "Guess I know who we're visiting next. Let's see what Mr. Walker has to say about chauffeuring a dead man into the woods." "Hold on," Hayes said, stopping him in his tracks. "Before we jump the gun, nothing connects Walker directly to the scene yet. He could have just dropped Dawson off somewhere. And we still don't know why Dawson was out there in the first place. This doesn't scream random attack. It's personal." "Personal, huh?" Boone said, turning back. "Then maybe the ex-wife holds more pieces of the puzzle. What's it gonna be, partner? Walker, or the lady with the restraining order?" Hayes exhaled, glancing at the clock on the wall. They had to move fast if they wanted to keep the trail warm. "Let's pay Grace Harper a visit," she finally said, standing up and tossing her notebook into her bag. "Walker's not going anywhere, and something tells me Mrs. Dawson has a lot more to say." As the two detectives grabbed their coats and headed out the door, the atmosphere in the precinct felt charged. They weren't just chasing a typical homicide. They were unraveling the threads of a life tangled in lies, bitterness, and motives yet unknown. Witnesses, and the first breakthrough. The investigation hit a pause as detectives meticulously combed through limited evidence. Brooklyn Pines wasn't the kind of place many people went out of their way to visit. It was no shock that no passers-by had come forward to report seeing anything unusual, not yet at least. But investigations like these often turned on luck, and luck arrived in the form of a sharp-eyed commuter. 3 days after Michael Dawson's body was discovered, Detective Laura Hayes received a call from her partner, Marcus Boone. He sounded almost excited, a rare occurrence. "Hayes, get this," Boone began, his voice buzzing over the line. "You know how we've been chasing our tails trying to pinpoint where Dawson might have gone before the woods? Well, we've got a possible sighting at Montclair Station. What? Hayes immediately sat up, pushing her notes aside. Who spotted him? Station worker, a train operator actually. Guy recognized Dawson's photo, said he saw him at Montclair late that afternoon, just a few hours before the estimated time of death. Hayes grabbed her notebook. And it gets better, Boone continued. Surveillance cameras caught Dawson exiting Montclair Station with a guy, hoodie, sunglasses, wearing the unofficial getup of someone trying really hard not to be noticed. Lovely, Hayes muttered, flipping to a clean page in her notebook. So, does train operator guy have any details? Did he overhear anything between them? Boone's tone sharpened slightly. Well, he did notice something weird. Said Dawson didn't look like his usual self, pacing, checking his phone constantly. The guy thought he looked agitated, maybe nervous, definitely not like he was meeting a buddy to hang out. Said he left with this other man toward the station parking lot. Surveillance confirms the same. Hayes jotted furiously. So he left Montclair and, what, got into a car? Was it Walker's sedan? That's the weird part, Boone said. Camera footage ends as they leave the station. No car visible, at least not from that angle, but there's more. Remember that lighter we found near the body? Hayes frowned. Yeah, some off-brand disposable thing. Well, Boone said, dragging out the suspense. CSI ran trace for fingerprints. 2 partial matches. One is Dawson, the other, unknown. No records in the system. Hayes closed her notebook with a sigh. Figures. So whoever moved him or tried to burn him had to handle the lighter at some point, and unless Dawson was real desperate to set fire to himself, the second print is key. It's not much, Boone admitted, but we know someone was there with him, maybe the hoodie guy, maybe someone else. Hayes exhaled, leaning back. Finally the hints of a trail. I need that Montclair footage, Marcus, all of it, every damn angle. Let's see if this shady buddy of his leads us somewhere, and the train operator? Planning to bring him in for a formal statement, Boone replied. We're also running logs at Montclair for ticket purchases. With some luck, we'll confirm what train Dawson took to Montclair and maybe snag a name. Hayes stood, grabbing her coat. I say we hit Montclair ourselves. Whoever this mystery man is, I don't want to give him a head start. You in? Boone grinned faintly through the phone as he hung up. At Montclair Station. By late afternoon, Hayes and Boone were standing amid the light bustle of Montclair Station. The train operator, an older man named Dennis Wilder, was waiting near the platform, his reflective vest glowing in the sunlight. You're the detectives? Dennis asked as he offered his hand. That's us, Hayes replied, shaking it firmly. Boone gave a nod. So, tell us about Dawson, Hayes urged as they walked toward the station's main hall. What made him stand out? Dennis shrugged. Well, it's like I told the officer on the phone. He seemed troubled. Kept looking over his shoulder, checking his phone every 2 seconds like someone was late or wasn't supposed to be there at all. It clicked as soon as I saw his photo on the news. The whole thing just didn't sit right with me. You said he was with someone? Boone chimed in. Yeah, Dennis nodded, gesturing vaguely to the parking area outside the station. Skinny guy in a hoodie with sunglasses. Real casual, but too casual, you know? I see people trying to blend in all the time. This guy stood out because he wanted to disappear. Did you hear them talk? Hayes pressed. Not much, Dennis admitted. Nothing loud or heated. Dawson whispered something quick like, this better be worth it. I figured it was an argument over cash or something shady, but they left together, just walked out like nothing. Boone raised an eyebrow. And then? Dennis motioned toward the platform. That's it. They disappear into the parking lot, no clue where they went after that. Hayes shared a glance with Boone. A meeting that wasn't supposed to happen. A companion trying too hard to be invisible. And Dawson himself clearly on edge. Last question, Dennis, Hayes said. What time was this? Roughly 4:30, maybe 4:45, right before my shift ended. Boone nodded, jotting it down. And that lines up with the timeline for when Dawson would have been heading toward Brooklyn Pines. As Dennis left to return to work, Hayes and Boone headed toward the surveillance office to review the footage Dennis had mentioned. A chilling surprise. When they finally located the clip, it was all there. Dawson, fidgeting, glancing around nervously. Hoodie guy, moving with deliberate casualness, head tucked down to obscure his face even as the camera captured glimpses. But just before they disappeared out of the camera's line of sight, Hayes noticed something. Hoodie guy raised his head slightly to look around just enough that the camera briefly caught his profile. Hayes froze the frame, she and Boone leaned in closer. Not exactly clear, Boone admitted, but something about this guy feels familiar. Look at that jawline, the nose. It's Walker, Hayes murmured. John goddamn Walker, Boone straightened up. So much for the innocent mechanic, huh? This isn't just a case of unlucky timing anymore, Hayes said, snapping a photo of the frozen frame on her phone. Walker's deeper in this than he's letting on. We need to talk to him again, this time with an arrest warrant ready. As they exited the surveillance office, her phone buzzed with a text from the forensics team. The lighter print had been narrowed down further. Another lead to chase. Looks like it's gonna be a long night, Boone muttered. Wouldn't have it any other way, Hayes replied, a grim determination in her voice as they stepped into the gathering dusk. The driver and emerging mysteries detectives Laura Hayes and Marcus Boone drove up to a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Trenton. The sign above the workshop read, Walker's Auto and Repairs. It was a modest operation, with an old Chevy parked out front and the faint whirring sound of a drill coming from inside the garage. "This is our guy?" Boone asked, stepping out of the car and adjusting his coat against the light drizzle. "John Walker, 28, Hayes replied, flipping through her notes. "Works as a mechanic. The white sedan spotted on the surveillance footage is registered to him. If he's not involved, he's got a hell of a lot to explain." Boone nodded, glancing toward the garage. "Let's make sure we don't spook him. Guys like this act all tough, but the second they feel cornered, they'll clam up tighter than a vault." They walked into the shop, where Walker was crouched by an open hood, wiping his grease-stained hands with a rag. He looked up startled when he saw the two detectives approach. "You John Walker?" Hayes asked, holding up her badge. Yeah, that's me," Walker replied, his forehead creasing. "What's this about?" "We'd like to ask you a few questions about a white sedan registered in your name," Boone said, his tone casual but firm. Walker hesitated, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "Sure, yeah, is it about that speeding ticket? I already took care of that last month." "This isn't about a traffic violation," Hayes cut in. "Your car was spotted at Montclair Station 3 nights ago. Security footage shows it trailing a man named Michael Dawson. Ring any bells?" Walker froze for a moment, his face tightening. "Dawson? No. Don't think I know anyone by that name." Boone raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "That's funny, because we've got you on video at the station. Dawson gets off the train, you're right there in your white sedan. So let's try that again. What were you doing at Montclair Station?" Walker rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding their gaze. "All right, look, I was there. But I wasn't, this guy, Dawson you said? I didn't know his name or anything, I was just giving someone a lift, okay?" Hayes folded her arms. "Giving someone a lift to where?" "To Brooklyn Pines," Walker replied, shifting uncomfortably. "He said he needed to grab something out there. I wasn't really paying attention, to be honest." Boone leaned against the workbench, his eyes narrowing. "And why would you drive a stranger all the way to the woods for no reason? You're not Uber. What was the deal?" Walker sighed, glancing toward the open garage door as if contemplating his escape route. "Look, the guy offered me cash, alright? I was heading that way anyway to drop off some tools for a buddy. Figured, why not make a quick $50? "Did he tell you why he was going to the forest?" Hayes asked, her tone sharp. "No," Walker mumbled, his voice growing defensive. "I didn't ask, okay? He just said he needed to meet someone out there. He looked kinda stressed, I guess, but it's not like I pried into his business." "And once you got there?" Boone pressed. Walker hesitated again, his jaw tightening. "I dropped him off by the trailhead. He told me he'd be fine walking the rest of the way. That's it, I swear." "That's it?" Hayes asked, raising an eyebrow. "You conveniently forget to mention that 3 days later Dawson was found dead. Multiple stab wounds. Someone tried to burn the body, and you expect us to believe you just dropped him off and went on your merry way?" Walker's eyes widened. "Dead? Wait, hold on. What? Dead? I didn't know anything about that." Boone wasn't buying it. He crossed his arms and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "So let me get this straight. A guy asks you to drive him to the middle of nowhere, doesn't tell you why, and later winds up murdered. And you're saying all you did was drive the car? That's one hell of a coincidence, John." "I'm telling the truth," Walker insisted, his voice rising. "Look, I didn't even stick around, okay? I dropped him off and I left. I didn't see anyone else, didn't hear anything weird. I had no idea this would happen." Hayes watched him carefully, her keen eyes picking up on every twitch and fidget. "We're not saying you killed him, John. Not yet anyway. But you're in this up to your neck, whether you like it or not. So here's your chance to come clean. Were you working with someone? Did you see anyone else at the scene?" "No!" Walker practically yelled, his voice cracking. "I swear to God I didn't see anyone. I don't know who this Dawson guy even is." Boone and Hayes exchanged a glance. He was either a terrible liar, or he genuinely didn't know more than he was letting on. Either way, his involvement wasn't adding up. "All right, John," Hayes finally said, her voice firm. "Here's how this is gonna go. You're coming down to the station to give an official statement. If you're innocent like you say, you've got nothing to worry about. But let me give you a little advice. If there's anything you're leaving out right now, you better start talking before we dig deeper. Because trust me, we will. Walker exhaled shakily, nodding. Fine, whatever you need. But I'm telling you, I don't know anything else. As the detectives escorted him out of the garage, Boone leaned toward Hayes. So, driver or not, this guy's definitely hiding something. $50 to drive someone to the woods? Please. Agreed, Hayes muttered. Something stinks here and I don't think it's just engine grease. Let's see how his story holds up under pressure. As they left the auto shop with Walker in tow, the puzzle pieces of the case were slowly beginning to click into place. But one glaring question remained. If John Walker wasn't directly involved in the murder, why had Michael Dawson chosen him for the ride, and who had they come to meet in the woods? The mysterious woman enters the story. Detective Laura Hayes sat at her desk, staring at a file labeled Grace Harper. The name had come up repeatedly over the past 48 hours, from John Walker's vague statements to the restraining order found in Michael Dawson's file. Grace wasn't just a bystander in all this, she was right at the center. Hayes took a swig of her now cold coffee just as Marcus Boone walked in, tossing a manila folder onto her desk. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, leaning on the doorframe. "What's this?" Hayes asked, flipping open the folder. Background on Grace Harper, ex-wife to Michael Dawson, current holder of a restraining order against him. And, as it turns out, she's not exactly the poster child for stability. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Filed for divorce 2 years ago, citing emotional abuse and manipulative behavior. The divorce got nasty. Dawson fought tooth and nail over their shared assets, and that's when things allegedly turned dark. Grace claimed he threatened her, said he'd ruin her, even claimed he was blackmailing her with personal photos. Hayes sighed. And yet, no formal charges? Nope, nothing stuck, probably because Michael was good at covering his tracks. But here's where it gets interesting, Boone said, crossing his arms. Grace made a 911 call 3 weeks ago, reporting someone standing outside her house late at night. Guess who she accused? Michael, Hayes guessed, already knowing the answer. Bingo, Boone said with a smirk. But by the time officers showed up, the guy was gone. Grace insisted it was him, though, said he'd been stalking her, and now 3 weeks later our guy is lying dead in a forest. Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing. This wasn't just a bad breakup. This is a powder keg. If Grace felt threatened, desperate enough... Exactly, Boone agreed. She's got motive written all over her. Does she know about Michael's death yet? Hayes asked abruptly. Boone nodded. We made sure of that. Uniforms stopped by her place this morning. They said she looked shaken, but not surprised. You want to bet she's been expecting this phone call? Hayes stood, grabbing her coat. Let's find out. The interview with Grace Harper. Grace Harper lived in a modest bungalow at the edge of Trenton. The house was neat, almost too neat, the kind of place where someone spent a lot of time keeping appearances up. Hayes and Boone exchanged glances as they stepped up to the front door. Boone knocked, the sharp raps echoing in the quiet suburban street. After a moment the door creaked open. Grace Harper stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes rimmed red as if she hadn't slept in days. Her blonde hair was tied back hastily, strands falling loose like she hadn't cared to tidy it up. "Detectives," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. "I figured you'd be coming." "Miss Harper, I'm Detective Hayes. This is my partner, Detective Boone. Do you mind if we come in?" Grace hesitated, gripping the edge of the door before stepping aside to let them enter. "Thank you," Hayes said, glancing around. The interior of the house was spotless, but there were signs of strain. A half-drunk cup of tea sat on the coffee table, next to a stack of disorganized papers. Grace motioned for them to sit, but remained standing herself, arms crossed over her chest. "I already told the officers this morning. I don't know anything about Michael's death." "Let's back up," Boone said, leaning against the arm of the couch. "We just want to get a clearer picture of your relationship with him. It's no secret things weren't exactly amicable between you two." Grace let out a hollow laugh. "Amicable? That's one word for it. Why don't you walk us through it?" Hayes asked gently. "In your own words." Grace swallowed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. "Michael, he wasn't always like this. When we first got married he was charming, supportive. But as the years went on, he changed. He wanted more control, over me, over everything I did. He'd monitor where I went, who I talked to. I thought it was because he cared, you know?" Boone raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her continue. "And then?" Hayes prompted. Grace's voice faltered. And then it got worse. He didn't just want control, he wanted submission. If I disagreed with him, if I said no to anything, he'd turn into someone else. Threatening, vindictive. It got unbearable, so I left. Leaving must have been hard, Hayes said. Were there threats? Grace nodded, her eyes welling up. He said if I didn't give him what he wanted in the divorce, he'd destroy me. Sent me emails, texts. He had private photos of me. I don't even know how he got them. He said he'd release them if I didn't comply. I went to the police, but you've seen his record. He was smart. Careful. And what about recently? Boone asked. Reports say you filed a complaint about someone outside your house. You told officers it was Michael. Grace's face hardened. It was Michael. He thought I belonged to him, that I couldn't move on. I've been looking over my shoulder for years, detectives. I wasn't safe while he was alive. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Hayes leaned forward slightly. Grace, what we're trying to figure out is how Michael ended up dead in the middle of Brooklyn Pines, miles from anywhere. Did he say anything to you? Did you see him recently? Grace shook her head. The last time I saw him was at the courthouse months ago. I didn't even know he was up there in Brooklyn Pines. Why would I? Do you know a man named John Walker? Boone asked, suddenly shifting gears. The color drained from Grace's face. What does John have to do with this? That's what we're trying to establish, Hayes replied carefully. Walker told us he gave Michael a ride to Brooklyn Pines the night he died. He also mentioned doing favors for someone he refused to name. Grace's lips trembled. Are you suggesting I had something to do with this? We're just asking questions, Hayes said, her voice steady. Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Michael destroyed my life, detective, but what you're implying, I wouldn't kill him. I didn't even know he was... She trailed off, tears spilling down her cheeks. Hayes stayed quiet, sensing the moment. Boone, however, spoke up. You might want to think real hard about what you do know, Grace. Because right now, your name keeps popping up in all the wrong places. A fatal piece of evidence at Grace's home. The cloudy sky over Trenton mirrored the atmosphere in the precinct as Hayes and Boone prepared to search Grace Harper's home. Their suspicions were growing, but they needed more than gut feelings and circumstantial connections to build their case. Grace's life was messy, her ex-husband's death even messier, and somewhere in the chaos, the truth was lurking. Think we'll find something solid in there? Boone asked as they pulled into Grace's driveway, her meticulously maintained bungalow sitting unnervingly quiet in the pale afternoon light. Call it a hunch, Hayes replied, unbuckling her seatbelt. Her story doesn't hold water. If she's innocent, she's the unluckiest person alive. If she's not, well, let's see what the place tells us. The knock on her door was barely audible over the pattering drizzle, but Grace opened it almost immediately. She was dressed in the same oversized sweater she'd worn the last time they visited, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept since their conversation. Detectives, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know why you're here again. I already told you. We've obtained a search warrant, Hayes said, her tone firm, but not unkind. It's standard procedure, just routine to help us close out all the unanswered questions in Michael's case. For a moment Grace looked like she wanted to protest, her lips parting slightly, but then she deflated. She stepped aside and motioned them in wordlessly. Searching for clues, Hayes and Boone moved methodically through the house. The living room was spotless as before, the shelves lined with framed photos of Grace smiling in happier times. A wedding picture of her and Michael, taken nearly a decade ago, sat slightly dusted off-center on a shelf. Hayes set it back upright without comment. Start in the living room, Hayes said to Boone. I'll check out the study. Boone rifled through drawers, flipping through a few utility bills and junk mail as Grace watched from the couch. She clutched a mug of cold tea in her hands, though she never raised it to her lips. Every so often, her gaze darted toward them, as if trying to anticipate their next move. Hayes entered the small study. It wasn't anything grand, just a desk, a filing cabinet, and a small window overlooking the backyard. She scanned the desk, shifting through a stack of opened envelopes labeled with her divorce lawyer's letterhead. Beneath them, she noticed something odd, a small piece of something charred, out of place in the otherwise tidy room. Looks like Grace isn't meticulous about everything, Hayes muttered, lifting the burned fragment carefully with gloved fingers. What did you find? Boone asked, leaning into the doorway. Something burned, Hayes replied, tilting the fragment toward the light. Got the scent of ash in here too, smells like she's been burning something recently. Boone raised an eyebrow. Why does that not surprise me? Hayes followed the faint smoky scent to the living room, her eyes locking onto the fireplace. The hearth was cold, the ashes undisturbed, but tucked along the metal grate was a crumpled piece of paper, partially burned. Carefully, she pulled it out, laying it flat on the coffee table in front of Boone. The edges were singed black, but some words were still legible in bold, angry strokes. "You think you can walk away from this? You're going to pay for the damage you've done, Grace." "Charming," Boone muttered, leaning closer to read. "That's Michael, all right," Hayes said. "No question. Grace said he's been sending her threatening messages. Looks like she might have tried to get rid of them." "Think she burned more?" Boone asked, gesturing to the fireplace. "Let's hope the forensic team can piece it together," Hayes replied, setting the half-burned note aside. Carefully, she continued examining the grate's contents, uncovering bits of other charred papers. One particularly damning fragment sent a chill up her spine. This one was harder to decipher, but there was no mistaking the phrase, "Those photos will ruin you." Confrontation. Hayes and Boone returned to the living room where Grace sat nervously clutching her mug. "Grace," Hayes began evenly, holding up the burned note. "Care to explain this?" Grace's eyes widened. "What is that? Where did you find that?" "In your fireplace," Boone said bluntly. "Doesn't exactly scream innocent, does it? Especially when it's clearly something Michael wrote to you." I don't know how that got there," Grace stammered, the mug trembling slightly in her hands. "You don't know?" Hayes pressed, stepping closer. "Grace, you claimed he'd been threatening you, and this, forensics will confirm it, proves that. But you didn't tell us about this before. Why? Were you trying to hide it, destroy it?" "No!" Grace's voice cracked, tears pooling in her eyes. "I wasn't trying to. I swear I didn't know!" Boone scoffed. "Come on, Grace, notes like these don't just magically appear in the fireplace. Either you burned them yourself or someone else did. Which is it? What were you trying to hide?" She didn't respond, instead burying her face in her hands. "Grace," Hayes said, her tone softening slightly. "We get that Michael hurt you. No one's disputing that. But right now these pieces of evidence are painting a picture of someone who was scared, angry, maybe even desperate. If there's more to the story, if there was someone else driving this, you need to tell us. This is your chance." Grace let out a shaky breath, finally meeting their eyes. "You don't understand. He destroyed my life. Every time I tried to move forward, he pulled me back. Those notes, the threats, they were almost daily, but I couldn't. Couldn't what?" Boone pushed. Grace shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're trying to say. I swear I didn't. I didn't want anyone else to see those messages. They were humiliating. He was going to ruin me." "Did you burn them?" Hayes asked pointedly. "Yes," Grace whispered finally. "I burned them. All the notes, the texts, anything that reminded me of him. But I didn't kill him. I wasn't even there." Hayes and Boone exchanged a glance. Grace might be hiding more, but the sheer panic in her voice suggested she wasn't lying, at least not entirely. "All right," Hayes said after a moment. "We'll have the lab analyze the fragments, but Grace, burning evidence tied to your ex-husband's threats doesn't help your case. If you're truly innocent, you'll let us know everything, before the timeline collapses on you. A major breakthrough." Later that evening at the precinct, the forensics team called Hayes and Boone back. "We've got something from those burned papers," a technician said, holding up a partially reconstructed note. "This one confirms what you've already found. More threats from Michael Dawson. But this one here?" Hayes squinted at the note. Amid the legible lines were a cryptic instruction. "Walker will make sure we settle this." Hayes raised her eyebrows. "Walker? There's no way that's a coincidence." Boone leaned over her shoulder. "Well, looks like Grace put our favorite mechanic on her contact list after all. Question is, what exactly did she have him settle?" "Only one way to find out," Hayes replied. "Let's see what John Walker has to say when we show him this." As they prepared to head back to Walker's small auto shop, the case only grew darker. Whatever had started as Michael's manipulation and Grace's desperation was morphing into something else. A conspiracy tangled in secrets and lies, with every piece of evidence leading them deeper into a chilling conclusion. Marital conflict and the motive for murder. The precinct interrogation room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the metal table. Grace Harper sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her pale face etched with defiance and exhaustion. Across from her sat Detective Laura Hayes, calm and composed, her hands folded softly on the table. Marcus Boone leaned against the back wall, his imposing frame silent but watchful, like a lion waiting to pounce. "Grace," Hayes began in her even, practiced tone, "we've gone through a lot of evidence over the past week, and I think we both know things with Michael weren't peaceful." Grace stiffened in her chair but said nothing. "So, Let's stop dancing around it, Boone interjected, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a knife. What was really going on between you two? Grace hesitated, her lips parting slightly before she clamped them shut again. Her fingers gripped the edge of her sweater like it was the only thing keeping her together. Grace, we found a lot of pieces to this puzzle, Hayes added gently. Threatening notes, burned messages in your fireplace, Walker's shady involvement, it's all pointing to a very complicated past with Michael, and possibly a motive. Grace looked up sharply, her eyes flashing with defensive fury. A motive? Are you implying that I did this? We're implying that you had every reason to want your ex-husband gone, Boone said bluntly, pushing off the wall and stepping closer to the table. What we're not clear on yet is how much you were involved. Grace's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead light. Finally, she let out a shaky breath, her voice trembling. You want to know what was going on? Fine, I'll tell you. Michael was a monster. He was charming on the outside, sure. To everyone else, he was the perfect husband. But behind closed doors, he was controlling, manipulative. He thought he owned me. Hayes nodded slowly, leaning in slightly. Go on? When we first got married, I didn't notice it, Grace continued, her voice gaining a brittle edge. It's the little things, you know? Comments about what I wore, checking my phone just to be safe, needing to know who I was meeting for lunch. I thought it was love. I was so stupid. Boone exchanged a quick glance with Hayes but remained silent, letting Grace talk. But then it escalated, Grace continued, her voice cracking. He wanted to control every part of my life, my money, my friendships, even my thoughts. And when I finally decided I couldn't take it anymore, when I filed for divorce, She paused, swallowing hard. Threatened you? Hayes prompted. Grace gave a bitter laugh, tears brimming in her eyes. Threatened doesn't even cover it. He promised to destroy me. Told me he'd ruin my reputation, drag me through the mud, said he had a leverage. Leverage? Boone pressed, stepping closer. What kind of leverage are we talking about? Grace looked down, refusing to meet their eyes. He had photos, private ones, from years ago. I don't even know how he got them. But he said that if I didn't give him what he wanted in the divorce, if I didn't agree to his terms, he'd send them to everyone I knew. My boss, my family, my friends. Hayes scribbled notes as Grace wiped at her eyes with trembling hands. And after the divorce? Boone asked, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. Did it stop? Grace shook her head. Of course not. He kept showing up, calling, texting. He made it clear that just because we were divorced didn't mean I was free of him. She stopped, glancing at the detectives warily. He followed me. He'd wait outside my house at night, just sitting in his car, watching. I couldn't live like that anymore. Did you ever report this behavior? Hayes asked, though she already knew the answer. I tried, Grace said bitterly. But the restraining order, it was useless. By the time the police showed up, he'd be gone. And he knew how to push just enough to avoid getting caught. Boone folded his arms. So what changed? Why would Michael suddenly end up in Brooklyn Pines, of all places? Grace hesitated. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. I don't know, she said softly. But there was something in her voice, an edge of doubt, of fear. Grace, Hayes said gently, leaning in closer, if there's something you're not telling us, now is the time to come clean. We're not here to judge you. We're here to find the truth. But if you keep holding back, we won't stop digging until we find it on our own. And trust me, that's going to look a whole lot worse for you. Grace glanced up, her tear-filled eyes searching Hayes's face. You wouldn't understand, she whispered. Try us, Boone said. Grace exhaled shakily, her voice barely audible. A few weeks ago, Michael found out about John. Hayes frowned. Walker? Grace nodded, biting her lip. It wasn't serious, it was, I don't know, nothing, but Michael, he thought he could use it. He said he'd ruin both our lives, and for once I was scared enough to do something about it. What did you do, Grace? Boone asked, his voice low and steady. I asked John to talk to him, Grace admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. Just to scare him a little, to make him back off. I didn't want him dead, I thought if someone stood up to him, maybe he'd leave me alone. The room was deathly silent. Boone's jaw tightened, and Hayes's pen stilled over her notebook. That's quite the gamble, Boone said finally. You knew John wasn't exactly stable. You had to know this wasn't going to end well. I didn't think it would go that far, Grace cried, fresh tears streaming down her face. I didn't know John would— I didn't know. Hayes leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Grace, what you're telling us sounds a lot like motive. Michael was threatening your life, your privacy, your safety. You turned to John and now Michael's dead. You need to be very clear with us. Were you involved in planning this?" "No!" Grace shouted, her voice shaking. "I told you I didn't know it would go this far. I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do." Hayes watched her for a long moment, the silence heavy in the room. Finally she stood, nodding to Boone. "We're done here for now." As they walked out of the room, Boone let out a low whistle. "Well, she's either the most guilt-ridden innocent person I've ever met, or this is the quietest confession in the history of confessions." Hayes didn't respond. Her mind was already moving ahead, piecing together Grace's desperation with John Walker's violent tendencies. The motive was clear, but the truth was still murky, and they were running out of time to figure out what really happened in the shadows of Brooklyn Pines. John Walker's confession. The interrogation room was cold, stark, and clinical, save for the buzzing fluorescent light above that cast sharp shadows against the cement walls. John Walker sat slouched in his seat, his grease-stained hands fiddling with a styrofoam coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Across from him were Detectives Hayes and Boone, both leaning slightly forward, their posture a mix of calculated authority and coiled energy waiting to pounce. "All right, John," Boone started, his voice deep and pressing. "This is your chance to explain yourself. We've got surveillance footage, a car linked to you, and a lady named Grace who says her life's been complicated because of this whole situation, but right now, you're in the center of it. So start talking." Walker scoffed, running a grubby hand through his unkempt hair. "I already told you everything. I didn't kill the guy, all right?" Hayes narrowed her eyes, her voice quiet but sharp. "John, you left some pieces out, and the parts you did tell us, they don't add up. You drove Dawson to Brooklyn Pines, you dropped him off. 3 days later he's found stabbed to death with burns nearby, and somehow you expect us to believe you're just an unlucky chauffeur?" Walker shook his head, his voice rising. "I didn't kill him. I swear on my life, I didn't touch him." "Then explain," Hayes said, leaning forward and locking eyes with him. "Let's start from the beginning. Why were you even there, John? Dawson doesn't call random mechanics for rides, and you aren't exactly running a charity service." Walker let out a long exhale, staring at the cracked surface of the table like he was searching for words embedded in the wood. "Look, Grace called me, all right?" Hayes glanced sharply at Boone before focusing back on Walker. "Grace Harper?" "Yeah," Walker admitted, slouching a little deeper into his chair. "She said she was sick of her ex messing with her, said the guy was ruining her life and needed someone to put him in his place." Boone's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "So you're not just the driver, you're the muscle. What did she want you to do?" "She didn't ask me to kill him, all right?" Walker snapped, his voice pitching up defensively. "She just wanted me to scare him. That's it, I swear. Just a couple words, maybe rough him up a bit. She said he wouldn't leave her alone, and I figured, I don't know, maybe I could help out. I didn't sign up for this shit." "So, how did it end up with Dawson dead?" Hayes asked, her voice cold. "Walk us through it, step by step." Walker rubbed his temples as if warding off a headache. "Fine, I'll tell you everything. Grace called me a few days before, said Michael was going out of town, maybe to blow off some steam, and that it was the perfect time to teach him a lesson. Stupid me decided to help out, didn't even think twice. Made a quick $50 giving her ex a ride from Montclair. I knew it was shady, but I didn't care. I thought he'd just listen and crawl back into whatever hole guys like him belong in." "And Dawson," Boone interjected, "did he know what you were planning to do?" "I didn't say anything at first," Walker replied, his voice quieter now. "I picked him up, asked him where he needed to go, just acted casual. But once we got closer to Brooklyn Pines, he started asking me a lot of questions, like, 'Are you sure this is the spot? And you're not planning something, are you?' He was already on edge. When we got near the trailhead, he figured it out. That's when things went sideways." "What do you mean, sideways?" Hayes pressed. Walker slammed his palm against the table, the sound echoing through the room. "He freaked out, okay? Started yelling at me, calling me a punk, saying how I didn't have the guts to do anything. I told him to calm down, but he wouldn't stop running his mouth, just kept going on about how Grace was pathetic, how she'd never win against him. He hit a nerve, all right," I snapped. Boone leaned forward, the intensity radiating off him like heat. "And what did you do, John?" Walker's eyes darted to the floor. "I got out of the car and grabbed him, told him to shut up, that's it, I never meant to kill him. But he pushed me first. I swear, he pushed me. I grabbed his shirt and he swung back. It was a fight, just a stupid, messy fight where neither of us knew what the hell we were doing. I thought I could just scare him. But then..." Walker's voice cracked and trailed off. "But then what?" Hayes asked, her tone unrelenting. Walker's hands clenched into fists on the table. "There was a knife. I don't even know where it came from. Maybe he had it, maybe it was in the car. Hell, I don't know. But it was in my hands. And the next thing I knew, he wasn't yelling anymore. He was just on the ground. Covered in blood, Boone added bluntly. Walker nodded reluctantly, his eyes darting between the two detectives as if waiting for some shred of understanding. Yeah, covered in blood. Hayes watched him, her gaze cutting through his feigned ignorance. So, why not call for help, John? Why not come clean the second things went south? Walker leaned back, almost laughing bitterly. You think anyone would believe me if I said I didn't mean it? The guy's lying there, dead because of me. And Grace wanted this to happen. She didn't say it, but she wanted someone else to solve her problem for her. What difference would it make if it was an accident? Hayes exchanged a quick glance with Boone. What about the lighter, John? The burn marks near Dawson's body aren't exactly accidental. Walker paled visibly, his bravado deflating instantly. I thought if I burned part of the site, maybe there wouldn't be fingerprints. It was a stupid idea, okay? I panicked. Nothing burned right anyway. Didn't even scorch through the leaves. I grabbed my stuff and ran. Where's the knife now? Boone demanded. Walker shrugged weakly. Lost it in the woods somewhere. I freaked out, tossed it when I ran back to the car. I didn't look back, Detective. Not once. Not once, Hayes repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. What about Grace? Did you tell her what happened? I called her, Walker blurted out, his voice cracking. Told her it got out of hand and she just hung up. She didn't want to hear it, kept saying, I didn't ask for this, John. Like it was all my fault. Well, John, Boone said, standing straight and towering over the table, let me make this crystal clear. It is all your fault. Clean your hands with all the excuses you want, but you just confessed to murder, and no side of the story changes that. Walker's head fell into his hands as Hayes stood, her voice firm and cutting. You'll have your chance to tell the rest of this story to a jury. Let's hope they're as understanding as you're hoping. Investigating the conflicting statements. The precinct buzzed with quiet urgency as Detective Laura Hayes flipped through a thick file of evidence. Across from her, Marcus Boone sat at his desk, running his thumb along the edge of a styrofoam coffee cup. Tension hung heavy between them. Grace Harper had wept and claimed ignorance of Michael Dawson's murder. John Walker had broken down and admitted to being the man who killed Dawson, though he painted a story of panic and impulsive violence. But something wasn't adding up. Their stories overlapped in convenient places, but the gaps in their accounts left a chasm of unanswered questions. Here's the thing that's sticking with me, Hayes said, resting her hands on her desk. Grace insists she didn't know what John was going to do to Michael, but according to Walker, she called him, practically begged him to teach Michael a lesson. She sets the whole thing in motion, but then claims she's shocked by the outcome. Doesn't that feel a little too convenient? Boone leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Hell yeah, it does. And Walker? He's no innocent either. The guy's crying about how he panicked, how this wasn't the plan, but then he's out there disposing of evidence. Burning the site to hide fingerprints, tossing the knife. That's not just panic. That's a guy covering his tracks. Hayes nodded, staring at a timeline tacked up on the bulletin board by her desk. And they both agree on one thing. Michael was a problem. Grace says he was ruining her life, stalking her, threatening her, but Walker points her finger as the ringleader who wanted Michael out of the picture. Which one's playing us, Marcus? Boone tilted his head, a smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. Maybe both. Hayes grabbed her notebook and stood. Time to poke some holes in their stories. Let's start with John. I want to know every detail about how this plan came together. John Walker's interrogation. The interrogation room was quiet except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights. John Walker sat hunched over the table, staring at the water bottle in front of him like it held some kind of answer. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a defeated slump, though his eyes were wary as Hayes and Boone walked in. All right, John, Hayes said, taking a seat across from him. We've got more questions, and I suggest you start thinking very carefully about your answers, because right now, things aren't looking too good for you. Walker scoffed, shaking his head. What else do you want from me? I already told you. Yeah, I killed him. I didn't mean to, but it happened. That's it. Case closed, right? Not even close, Boone said, taking his usual spot, leaning against the wall. Because your story, it's full of holes, and now you're going to help us fill them in. Walker frowned, running a hand through his messy hair. What holes? I told you everything. Grace called me, asked me to scare the guy. I drove him out, things got heated, and it happened. What else do you want? We want to understand why you burned evidence, for starters, Hayes said, leaning forward. You told us it was panic, but burning the scene and tossing the knife isn't something you do unless you're trying to get away with something. Don't you think I freaking know that? Walker snapped, his voice rising. "I panicked, all right? I didn't know what else to do." Boone stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. "But that's not what's bothering me, John. What's bothering me is the way you said Grace wanted you to handle Michael. You made it sound like she knew exactly what you were capable of, like maybe this wasn't the first time." Walker's eyes widened slightly and he shook his head. "No, no way. I've never done anything like this before, I swear. Grace didn't ask me to kill him. She just wanted me to scare him, maybe push him around a little, that's it." "But here's the problem," Hayes interjected, her voice calm but piercing. "Grace says she didn't even know you'd agreed to help her. She denies asking you for anything, says she had no idea you'd even spoken to Michael that night." Walker blinked, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. "What? That's bull. She called me. She told me what she wanted. She said Michael was ruining her life, that he'd never leave her alone. She wanted me to fix it." "Fix it how?" Boone pressed, his arms crossed. "Because right now, John, it sounds like you're the fall guy. Look at it from our perspective. Grace claims she didn't know what was going to happen, and you're the one holding the knife. You think she's going to take responsibility for any of this?" Walker's face twisted in anger. She can't just say that. She knew. She asked me to help her deal with him, and now she's trying to pin this on me? No, no way. That's not fair." Hayes tilted her head. "Fair or not, John, that's what she's claiming. So here's your chance to set the record straight. What exactly did Grace say to you before that night? Word for word." Walker hesitated, his hands fidgeting on the table. "She called me, all right? She called and said Michael was out of control. She was crying, saying how he was going to ruin her life, how he had these photos, how she couldn't take it anymore. She said she needed him gone." "Gone?" Hayes repeated, her eyes narrowing. "Did she use that word?" Walker hesitated again, his expression shifting. No, not exactly, but that's what she meant. She said I could scare him, rough him up, make him back off. She didn't say to kill him, but she knew it might get messy. She knew it." "So you're saying Grace gave you the green light to hurt Michael as long as it solved her problem?" Boone asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. "Yes, no, I don't know," Walker stammered, his composure cracking further. "She didn't tell me to kill him, okay? But she didn't stop me either. What was I supposed to do? Just let him keep ruining her life?" Hayes let the silence hang for a moment, letting Walker's words settle like a lead weight. "So, John, here's what we're left with. Grace says she was desperate. You say you were helping her, but here's the thing. You still held the knife. You still made the decision to end Michael's life. Grace might have been scared, but you turned this into a murder." Walker slumped forward, his head in his hands. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want it to go this far." "And yet it did," Hayes said quietly. "So now, we're going to find out the truth. And if Grace was as involved as you're claiming, we'll find that out too." Boone moved to open the door, quietly motioning for the next step. "Looks like it's time to call Grace in again. Let's see if her story holds up against this." Grace's second interrogation. The detectives left Walker in the interrogation room, his confession recorded and his guilt obvious. But as Hayes and Boone prepared to confront Grace again, it was clear that her part in the story was far from resolved. If Walker was the weapon, was Grace the one who aimed it? Ambiguous testimony and a shocking secret. The interrogation room barely exhaled tension. It seemed to hang palpably in the air between Grace Harper and the two detectives, Laura Hayes and Marcus Boone. Grace sat upright, stiff, like the metal chair might swallow her if she relaxed for even a second. Her fingers tapped erratically against the table, an unconscious betrayal of her nerves. Across from her, Hayes sat composed, pen resting in her hand but unmoving, while Boone leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed but his gaze sharp. "Grace," Hayes began, her voice controlled but crackling slightly under the weight of the truth she was chasing. "We're at a crossroads in this investigation. You've told us your version of events. You were scared, threatened, emotionally exhausted, but you've denied any knowledge of Michael's final hours, or of what John Walker might have done that night." Grace blinked rapidly, clasping her hands together. "Because it's the truth! I don't know anything about what happened in those woods. I've said this so many—" "Here's the problem," Hayes interrupted softly, cutting off her excuse with almost surgical precision. "John's story tells us a very different version, and we've got evidence, Grace. Fragments of burned notes recovered from your fireplace, Walker's car parked at the drop-off point, his testimony tying you directly to this entire setup. So if you keep telling us you're not involved—" Hayes paused, leaning forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking on Grace. "You're going to dig yourself into a hole you can't climb out of." Grace's face paled further as though someone had drained the remaining color from it. Boone decided it was time to turn up the heat. "Grace," he said, his deep voice almost growling as he stepped away from the wall and moved closer to her. "I don't think you fully understand what's at stake here. Right now, it looks like you lit the match that started this fire. Walker's already told us you called him, said you begged him to handle Michael, that you wanted this little problem of yours to disappear." "That's not true!" Grace shot back, her eyes wide with desperation. "John's lying! He's trying to save himself, isn't he? He's pinning this on me to make it look like my idea, but it wasn't." Boone's eyebrow quirked up slightly. "That's funny, Grace, because your name seems to come up in every single corner of this case. Walker doesn't make random decisions, but somehow you're saying he drove your ex-husband into the woods, stabbed him multiple times, and tried to burn the evidence, all without a nudge from you? That sound reasonable to you? Because it sure as hell doesn't to me." Grace looked cornered. Her shoulders slumped, and she turned to Hayes as if searching for a gentler reprieve. "Detective Hayes," Grace began, her tone softer and pleading, "you have to believe me. Yes, I called John. Yes, I was scared of Michael and wanted him to leave me alone, but I never—" She choked on her words, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never asked John to kill him. That wasn't part of this. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Hayes watched her carefully, not blinking. "Then what did you think was going to happen, Grace? You involved John, a guy with a record for petty violence, someone you clearly knew wasn't a saint. You can't sit there and tell me you thought this would end with a handshake and an apology." Grace's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled as they rubbed against each other on the table. "No," Boone pressed, stepping forward again. "You thought you could wash your hands of it, that's my guess. Walker does the dirty work, Michael's out of your life, and you play the innocent victim. That your plan?" "No!" Grace shouted suddenly, her voice shaky but louder than before. "You don't understand. I just wanted Michael to stop. He was ruining everything, my life, my future. I thought if John scared him enough, he'd finally leave me alone. I didn't expect things to go this far." The room settled into stillness again, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and Grace's heavy breathing. She avoided the eyes of both detectives now, staring hard at the table as though she might fall apart under the weight of their scrutiny. Boone scoffed. "That's real convenient, Grace, real neat. Toss the blame onto the dead guy and the guy holding the knife and you get to walk away clean as a whistle. Too bad that charred note we found in your fireplace thinks otherwise." Grace froze. "What note?" she whispered. Hayes leaned forward, her tone deceptively mild. "The one where Michael accuses you of trying to destroy him. The one where it's clear this wasn't just some harmless spat between you two. You were locked in a toxic, destructive cycle and you burned his threats." "I was scared," Grace admitted, barely more than a whisper. "Scared enough to call John Walker to intervene?" Hayes finished for her. "Yes," Grace said softly. Boone pounced. "And you thought Walker might get rough with Michael, didn't you?" Grace's lip quivered, but she didn't answer. "Answer the damn question, Grace," Boone demanded, his voice rising. "Maybe," Grace yelled. "Okay, maybe I thought he'd rough him up, but I didn't think he'd kill him." Her voice cracked and tears rolled down her cheeks. Hayes exchanged a glance with Boone, the wheels turning in her head. Grace admitted Walker's involvement, but the gaps in her story still gnawed at her. Walker's testimony painted her as manipulative, as the one who pushed him over the edge. How much of that was the truth, and how much was Walker trying to save himself? Before Hayes could speak, Grace took a shaky breath and added something that sent a ripple through the room. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Hayes and Boone froze. "Go on," Hayes said cautiously. "John called me after it happened," Grace admitted, her hands shaking violently now. He was panicked. He said Michael was dead, and he didn't know what to do. He told me about the knife, the blood, and I hung up. I couldn't hear it, I couldn't process it, I just hung up on him." "And then you burned the notes," Hayes said softly. Grace nodded. "I was terrified. I thought if you found those messages, if you thought I was involved—" Boone let out a harsh laugh, though it held no humor. "Well, Grace, we found them anyway. And you're right. They don't make you look good." Hayes tapped her pen against the table, organizing her thoughts. "So, you admit John called you. You admit you burned evidence that tied you to Michael's threats. But here's what I need to know, Grace. Did you orchestrate this? Did you tell John to kill Michael?" Grace shook her head violently. "No, I swear no, I just wanted it to stop. I didn't tell him to—" Her voice cracked again. "I didn't want him to die." Hayes stared at her, searching for any micro-expression, any flicker of deceit. Part of her believed Grace, another part, the colder part, the part honed by years in the field, didn't trust her sob story one bit. As they left the room, Boone let out a low whistle. "She's either the saddest case of desperation I've ever seen," he muttered, "or she's the smartest manipulator we've dealt with." Hayes didn't reply, her mind replaying Grace's final words over and over again. Somewhere in all the lies and half-truths, there was the key to this puzzle. She just had to find it before Grace or Walker twisted the narrative one more time. The trial and the price to pay. Courtroom 3B of the Trenton County Courthouse was packed to the rafters. The buzzing low murmur of spectators, reporters, and legal teams set the tone as everyone waited for the high-profile trial to begin. On one side of the room, John Walker sat at the defendant's table, wearing a cheap suit that barely fit, his face a mixture of defiance and resignation. Next to him, his public defender shuffled through a chaotic pile of papers. Across the courtroom, Grace Harper sat behind the prosecution's team, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if trying to physically hold herself together. Detectives Laura Hayes and Marcus Boone entered the room quietly, observing from a few rows back in the gallery. Boone leaned slightly toward Hayes as they took their seats. "Feels like we've been living this case forever," he muttered under his breath. "You ready for all the fireworks about to go off in here?" Hayes kept her eyes focused on Walker. "I just want to hear him try and spin his story under oath," she replied coolly. "It'll be a masterclass in desperation." The judge entered, bringing the room to order. The first witness on the stand was one of the crime scene investigators, who outlined the physical evidence linking Walker to the gruesome murder, namely the surveillance footage from Montclair Station, the charred lighter found near Michael Dawson's body, and Walker's half-hearted attempt to destroy evidence at the scene. Next, forensic analysts took the stand to describe the stab wounds, how the blood spatter patterns told a grim story of struggle and chaos in the woods. But everyone in the courtroom knew the key moments in the trial would come down to two people: John Walker's testimony and Grace Harper's. John Walker takes the stand. When Walker finally approached the witness stand, a faint collective murmur rippled through the room. He held his head high, though the beads of sweat on his forehead betrayed a nervous undercurrent. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman wearing a sleek navy blazer, approached first. "Mr. Walker, you've admitted under interrogation that you killed Michael Dawson," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Would you care to remind the court why?" Walker hesitated visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I wasn't there to kill him, I swear. Grace, she called me and asked me to help her deal with him. I thought I could scare him, rough him up a little, you know? I wasn't planning to... His words stumbled and fell apart. "To stab him 13 times?" the prosecutor interjected sharply. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Walker's lawyer shot out of his chair. "Objection! Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," the judge said, though his firm tone carried a note of disapproval toward Walker himself. The prosecutor pivoted, her tone softening slightly, though her eyes cut through him like a scalpel. "John, you claim this wasn't premeditated, yet you brought Michael to Brooklyn Pines under false pretenses. You fought him, and when things didn't go your way, you pulled a knife and stabbed him repeatedly. And afterward, you tried to burn the evidence. Does any of that sound like an accident to you?" Walker's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, his composure cracked as he stammered, I panicked. I didn't want to kill him. It was out of control. I didn't know what else to do." The prosecutor pressed forward. "And what about Grace Harper? You claim she orchestrated this, that this was her plan all along. Do you honestly believe a woman who was so terrified of her ex-husband's control over her life would risk getting caught in a plot like this?" "She told me to!" Walker shouted suddenly, his voice breaking. "She didn't say it outright, but she made it clear. She said she couldn't take it anymore, that she needed him out of her life. She used me." He pointed a shaking hand toward Grace, who sat frozen behind the prosecution's table, her face expressionless but pale. "She's the reason this happened." But the jury remained unmoved. Walker's unsteady performance on the stand only served to reinforce the image of a desperate man, grasping at excuses to justify a crime that had spiraled out of his control. Grace Harper's turn. If Grace had hoped to avoid taking the stand, the prosecution's careful strategy eliminated all chances of that. When she was finally called, the tension in the room was palpable. She walked to the stand slowly, brushing an invisible strand of hair out of her face as she settled nervously into the chair. Her lawyer began by gently leading her through the challenges she faced before the murder, the toxic control Michael Dawson had over her life, the restraining orders that proved useless, the emotional toll she endured for years. Her testimony was raw and heartbreaking, and many in the courtroom hung on her every word. But then, it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, and the mood shifted like a cold gust of wind. "Miss Harper," Walker's lawyer began, a wiry man with sharp glasses that gave him the appearance of a hawk spotting its prey, "you've told the court how terrified you were of your ex-husband, terrified to the point of involving Mr. Walker, isn't that right?" Grace hesitated, her lips trembling slightly. Yes, I asked John to confront him, to scare him, the lawyer repeated, his voice lilting slightly like he found the phrase amusing. "Did you also suggest that scaring him might involve physical violence?" "No," Grace said quickly, shaking her head. "I just thought if someone stood up to Michael he'd finally stop. I didn't tell John to hurt him, I swear." Walker's lawyer pushed harder. "And yet, you chose to involve Mr. Walker, a man you knew through previous interactions was involved in petty crimes and wasn't exactly known for his gentle demeanor. Why?" Grace's composure wavered. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she said almost in a whisper. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I was desperate." "Desperate enough to burn evidence that connected you to Michael," the lawyer shot back, his voice rising. "I wasn't trying to hide anything," Grace snapped through tears. I couldn't bear to look at those notes anymore. It was like he still had control over me, even after he was gone." The defense lawyer tilted his head slightly as if contemplating her words. "So you admit you tampered with potential evidence relating to the crime?" Grace fell silent, trapped by her own admission. Final verdict. After days of emotional testimony, tense cross-examinations, and the meticulous presentation of evidence, it was ultimately the jury's deliberations that provided the final word. John Walker's attempt to shift blame onto Grace Harper proved unsuccessful. The overwhelming physical evidence, his presence at the scene, the blood on his clothes, the surveillance footage, painted him as the primary perpetrator. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As for Grace Harper, her role in the crime, though morally murky, did not meet the legal standard for criminal charges. She was not convicted of any crime, but she left the courtroom a pariah in the eyes of the public. The knowledge that her fear and desperation had unleashed Walker onto Michael was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. Hayes and Boone stood outside the courthouse as the crowd dispersed, reporters shouting questions at anyone within range. Boone leaned against a lamppost, hands jammed into his coat pockets. "Well," he said finally, breaking the silence, "justice was served, I guess, if you can call it that." Hayes nodded, watching Grace slip quietly into a car at the curb. "Justice doesn't always feel clean," she replied. "But we pulled the truth out of a hell of a mess. That's something." Boone let out a long breath. "This case, it's going to stick with me for a while." "Me too," Hayes admitted. "Some cases don't leave you. They crawl under your skin and stay there." As they walked toward their car, the weight of the case pressed heavily on them. They had uncovered the lies, exposed the motives, and brought a killer to justice. But the human wreckage left behind would never fully heal. Lessons from a tragedy in the shadows. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of the precinct, casting long, slanted shadows across the room. Detective Laura Hayes sat at her desk, her fingers idly tracing the edges of a photograph from the case, Michael Dawson's bloodied belongings laid out in neat clinical rows for evidence. Across from her, Marcus Boone sank heavily into a chair, his tie loosened and a deep weariness etched into his face. "You'd think solving a case would feel more satisfying," Boone muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. He stretched one leg out, rubbing his knee absent-mindedly as if the case itself had left him physically sore. "But this one, it just lingers." Hayes glanced up at him, her own expression tired but thoughtful. "That's the thing about cases like this. There aren't any real winners, just people left to pick up the pieces." Boone leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let out a long, heavy sigh. "You look at them, Grace, Walker, even Michael, and there's not a single one of them who wasn't broken. Not that it excuses what happened, but hell, Hayes, do you ever feel like we're just putting band-aids on a wound too deep to heal?" Hayes tilted her head, considering his question. "Sometimes." Her voice was quiet, reflective. "But it's not about fixing everything, Marcus. It's about shedding light on what happened and making sure the truth is told. That's all we can do." Boone chuckled darkly. "The truth, huh? Grace walked out of there today, technically innocent but carrying enough guilt to drown in. Walker's going away for the rest of his life, and yeah, he deserves it, but he was just a pawn in something bigger. Michael, well, he's 6 feet under and ultimately the architect of his own destruction, so where's the truth in all that? The truth, Hayes said firmly, her gaze steady, is that their choices had consequences. Every single person in this case made decisions that led them here. Walker let his temper get the best of him. Grace thought she could manipulate others to clean up her life, and Michael, he thought he could control the people around him without paying the price. That's the truth. And sometimes, Marcus, that's all the truth needs to be. A lesson no one walks away from clean. Boone snorted softly, leaning back in his chair. So, what's the lesson here then? Don't mess with people, don't trust anyone with their back against the wall? Because honestly, all I'm walking away with is a pile of regret. Hayes shook her head, a faint, almost sad smile playing on her lips. The lesson isn't for us, Marcus. It's for them. Grace will have to live with the fact that her choices unleashed Walker. Walker will have to live with the fact that he let himself become a weapon. And Michael, well, maybe this is what happens when you push people too far. We can't carry that weight for them. We just have to make sure it's on the record. Boone drummed his fingers on the desk, the rhythmic tapping filling the silence as he mulled over her words. You ever think about what would have happened if just one thing had gone differently? If Grace had gone to someone else for help instead of Walker? If Michael had just let her go? Hell, if Walker hadn't grabbed that knife. Feels like this whole thing was one big domino effect. Hayes leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed loosely. Every case is a domino effect, Marcus, but it's not about what could have happened. It's about what did happen. Thinking about the what-ifs will drive you crazy in this line of work. Boone sighed again, this time softer, and let his gaze drift toward the window. Still, there's a sadness to it. All three of them dragged each other down into the mud. And for what? Fear? Pride? Control? Doesn't feel like anyone learned anything. They will, Hayes said after a moment. People like Grace and Walker, they carry that weight forever. And maybe it doesn't change anything, but it changes them. That's the point, Marcus. Sometimes making it through the fire is the only way to change. Boone let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You think she'll change? Grace, I mean. Hayes shrugged, her voice quiet. I don't know, but I think it'll haunt her. And sometimes the haunting is enough. The room fell silent for a while, the faint hum of the building's air conditioning filling the space as both detectives sat lost in thought. The case was over, the evidence filed, the verdicts delivered, but the emotional wreckage lingered like smoke after a fire. Finally Boone spoke again, his voice softer, almost hesitant. You ever wonder if this job, if it changes us too? Hayes didn't answer right away. She let the question hang in the air, her mind turning over the years she'd spent chasing the truth, the late nights, the faces of the guilty and the grieving. Every case leaves a mark, she said finally. Maybe it's not as obvious as what Grace or Walker will live with, but it's there. You carry it with you. It changes the way you look at the world. Boone nodded slowly, his gaze distant. And this one? What mark is this one leaving? Hayes took a deep breath, setting the photograph she'd been holding back on her desk. For me, it's a reminder that no matter how far people fall, it usually starts with something small, a fear, a doubt, a moment of anger. It all builds, brick by brick, until there's no way out but down. And for them? Boone asked. Hayes met his eyes, her expression steady. For them, it's the price they pay for every one of those bricks. It's not our job to rebuild their lives, Marcus. It's only to show them the cost. Boone let her words sink in, then let out a long, low whistle. You ever think, just once, you'd like to catch a case where nobody has to pay the damn cost? Hayes smirked faintly, though there was no humor in her eyes. If that case ever comes along, Marcus, you let me know. The two detectives sat in silence for a while longer, the long shadows of the day growing darker around them. The case was closed, but the weight of it lingered, heavy and unshakable. And maybe that was the real lesson. Some shadows never really leave. They just change shape, growing softer over time but never fully disappearing.